The Iarnrod Eireann Northern Ireland Railways Class 201 locomotives represent the most powerful and technologically ambitious diesel locomotives ever to have operated on the Irish rail network, and they occupy an important place in the story of the late 20th century railway modernisation across the island. Built between 1994 and 1995 by General Motors Diesel in Canada, the class was conceived as a new generation of express locomotive that would replace time-expired traction and bring Irish locomotive-hauled passenger services into a more modern era. With a power output of 3,200 horsepower, a maximum speed of 102 miles an hour, and a weight of 108.862 tons, the Class 201 combined high output, sophisticated control equipment, and modern crew facilities in a way not previously seen in Ireland. In both appearance and capability, they marked a decisive break from earlier locomotive policy and were intended to provide a durable, high-performance fleet for the principally intercity and cross-border passenger services of the 1990s and beyond. By the early 1990s, the state of locomotive-hauled passenger traction in Ireland was becoming a matter of increasing concern. Much of the fleet in frontline use was aging, and although the 071 class, introduced in 1976, remained powerful and dependable, it was by then no longer young. Expectations of comfort, speed, reliability, and operational flexibility were changing, and there was growing recognition that any serious effort to improve the quality of rail travel would require investment not merely in track and stations, but also in modern motive power. The wider economic climate proved favourable to such an undertaking, as with Ireland entering into a period of accelerating economic growth that would become associated with the boom years of the 1990s, Éireann was able to begin a substantial programme of investment in its infrastructure and rolling stock. A major element of that programme was the decision to order a fleet of entirely new express diesel-electric locomotives from GM EMD, with 32 units for Éireann and a further 2 for Northern Ireland Railways. These locomotives, classified by the builder as JT42HCW, were intended above all for high-speed intercity work, particularly on the Dublin to Cork line, and on the prestigious Dublin to Belfast Enterprise service. The early history of the class was marked by an unusual and much publicised delivery arrangement, as in order to begin clearance trials, staff training and familiarisation before the bulk of the order arrived by sea, the first locomotive, number 201, was flown from London, Ontario to Dublin Airport aboard Antonov AN-124-100 heavy transport aircraft, Uniform Romeo 82066 of Air Ukraine. It arrived on Thursday, June 9, 1994, and a few days later, on Tuesday, June 14th, the first light engine test run took place from Inishore Works to Kildare, beginning the practical process of introducing the design to the Irish railway system. Deliveries of the remaining locomotives continued through 1994 and 1995, and the fleet gradually entered traffic as crews, depots and workshops adapted to a new type of locomotive that differed significantly from its predecessors in both equipment and operating philosophy. From a technical point of view, the Class 201 was among the most sophisticated diesel locomotive designs yet to appear in Ireland. It was powered by an EMD 12-710 G3B two-stroke diesel engine rated at 3,200 horsepower, driving through an AR8 PHEH CA6 main generator assembly and transmitting power to D43 traction motors. The locomotive was a COCO design, spreading its weight across 6 powered axles, and thereby providing the adhesion necessary for heavy passenger trains and later substantial freight workings. A key element of the design was the EM2000 digital traction computer, which allowed for more advanced diagnostics and control functions that had previously been available in Irish service. This represented a significant step towards computer-managed traction, enabling the locomotive to make better use of its power and provide more sophisticated fault monitoring. Another advanced feature was Super Series wheel creep control, a system intended to optimize adhesion by managing wheel slip under difficult rail conditions. The locomotives carried a 5A8147 auxiliary generator, producing 18 kilowatts, and a Gardner Denver WLPA-9B air compressor exhauster. They were also fitted with a Dayton Phoenix Model E7145 head-end alternator rated at 438 kV ampere, supplying 220/380 VAC 3-phase power at 50 Hz. In theory, this head-end power system was not an important part of the class's operational concept, but instead was meant to provide electrical power to passenger trains for heating, battery charging and other hotel services, thereby eliminating the need for separate generator vans on locomotive-hauled sets. In practice, however, this system did not become a general solution across the Irish passenger fleet, and while it saw use on the Enterprise service with the Dietrich coaching stock, it was not widely adopted elsewhere. The reasons included noise while trains were standing in stations and concerns over reliability, particularly because the prime mover had to run continuously at high speed in order to maintain the supply. As a result, the anticipated wholesale replacement of generator vans did not occur, and 4 Mark III generator vans remained in use on Enterprise workings, and later Mark IV sets incorporated their own generating capability in the driving van trailer, rather than depending on locomotive-supplied HEP. The locomotives also introduced to Ireland a number of pieces of equipment that were entirely new to Éireann Éireann motive power. These included an air dryer, electrically heated windscreens, cab-mounted electronic fuel gauges, train door control equipment, and an FM200 fire suppression system. Event recording equipment was installed as well, initially in the form of the Telloc 2200 recorder, while some cross-border locomotives later carried Hazer-Rail 2500 recorders. Active noise control in both cabs was another notable refinement, intended to improve crew comfort in what was otherwise a very powerful and acoustically forceful machine. The fully enclosed body style was itself something of a historical return, in that enclosed locomotive bodies had not been a normal feature of Irish diesel design since the 1950s Metrovic A and C classes, and on the Class 201, the enclosed form contributed to a cleaner, more modern appearance, while also helping with the protection of equipment and improving the environment for crews. Operational flexibility was built into the class from the outset, and all members were capable of multi-working with other IE and NIR EMD locomotives, allowing them to be paired or combined if necessary, even though such operation was not common in normal service. The locomotives were also designed to negotiate the relatively restrictive geometry of parts of the Irish railway network, with a minimum curve capability of 80 metres in yards, 115 metres on running lines, and 141 metres when coupled to a train. Within the class itself, there were 3 main subgroups, each distinguished by differing equipment and intended roles. Locomotives 201 to 205 and 210 to 214 had fixed buffers and shackle coupling arrangements and were not equipped for push-pull passenger work. Locomotives 215, 217 to 226, 229, 232 and 234 had retractable buffers, automatic or shackle coupling, push-pull capability, and electronic fuel gauges. A further group, comprising 206 to 209, 216, 227, 228, 230, 231 and 233, similarly had retractable buffers and push-pull operation, but in addition they were equipped with NIR train radio and TPWS AWS safety systems for cross-border services. This allowed them to work the Dublin to Belfast route under the safety and signalling conditions required in Northern Ireland. Once the fleet entered service in 1994 and 1995, it quickly became associated with Iarnrod Eireann's most prestigious passenger workings. Their arrival allowed the railway to present a more modern face on key routes and gave it locomotives with ample power in hand for fast schedules and heavy air-conditioned coaching stock. The Dublin to Cork corridor became one of the class's principal strongholds, while the cross-border Enterprise train between Dublin and Belfast also became a major sphere of operation, particularly once the new Dietrich coaching stock was introduced for that service. Yet the service career of the class was never wholly straightforward. Although powerful and impressive, the locomotives developed a checkered reputation, and over time they became known as a class whose capabilities were accompanied by significant maintenance and reliability challenges. Contemporary observers and later writers noted problems including engine fires and bogie cracks, and the class came to be regarded in some quarters as expensive to maintain. Also of note was the involvement of one member of the class in the Knockcroghty derailment of November 8, 1997, when 201 class number 211, hauling a Dublin-Houston to Westport Express, left the tracks due to a broken rail. Travelling at approximately 50 to 60 miles an hour, all but the locomotive itself derailed, but thanks to the sturdiness of the Mark III coaches, combined with a nearby embankment preventing them from tipping over completely, only 13 passengers were injured. As Irish passenger rail operations changed in the 2000s, these difficulties became more significant because the class was being increasingly judged not only against older locomotives, but against a new generation of multiple units which reduced the requirement for locomotive-hauled formations altogether. The major turning point in their career came with the transformation of Irish intercity rolling stock policy. The introduction of the 22,000 class diesel multiple units displaced locomotive-hauled passenger trains from most routes, while the Dublin to Cork line was re-equipped with Mark IV push-pull coaching sets, introduced in 2006 and 2007. These developments sharply reduced the number of diagrams for which the Class 201 was suited, and since the Mark IV sets required push-pull operation, and with other locomotive-hauled formations having disappeared, the non-push-pull members of the class rapidly lost their raison d'etre in passenger service. As a consequence, locomotives 201 to 205 and 210 to 214 were progressively withdrawn and placed into storage in 2009, with the last being 214 in July of that year. Many of these locomotives subsequently remained in storage for long periods and in effect became surplus to requirements, with some being used as sources of spare parts to support the active fleet. The locomotives that did remain active tended to be those fitted for push-pull and, in some cases, cross-border operation. Push-pull equipped members of the class continued to haul the Mark IV sets on Dublin to Cork services, and for many years these became the principal passenger workings of the Class 201 within the Republic of Ireland. Their green and silver intercity livery, introduced from around 2005 and later modified to incorporate the newer Éireann Eireann branding, became closely associated with these trains. All locomotives so employed carried full yellow ends to improve visibility, but even here, their dominance was not complete, as some Cork services later came to be operated by intercity railcar sets instead. The cross-border Enterprise service formed the other principal sphere of passenger work, with locomotives 208 and 209 belonging to Northern Ireland Railways and were later renumbered 8208 and 8209 to fit TransLink's computer systems, while the coaching stock itself was split between the two operators, with Iarnrod Eireann owning the odd-numbered coaches and Northern Ireland Railways the even ones. Meanwhile, in September 2012, in an effort to improve reliability and reduce maintenance costs, 4 former Mark III generator vans were introduced on the Enterprise route, effectively reviving the separate power car principle that head-end power had been expected to abolish. This decision reflected the railway's practical judgment that, whatever the theoretical advantages of locomotive-supplied train power, the actual cost in wear, tear and failures was too high, with the consequences of these issues being so serious that, at least in one case, Locomotive 230 was removed from service in June 2013 after suffering an engine fire while hauling a passenger service with HEP in use. As the passenger role of the class contracted, freight became increasingly important. Class 201 locomotives worked container traffic between Dublin Port and Ballina and were also used on other freight services as required. There were also trials and special workings that hinted at a possible wider freight future, with February 15, 2016, seeing locomotives 226 and 209 working freight trials with a long consist of 15 Hobbs ballast wagons and 1 unpowered locomotive, as an assessment of the class's ability to take on additional infrastructure or freight duties. Even so, route restrictions remained relevant, with the locomotives not able to operate over the Larne line because of weight clearance limitations. A number of individual locomotives acquired particularly notable histories within the class, with number 216 River Dodder being withdrawn in 2009 as surplus to requirements, but later returned to service in 2016 to hold the luxury Belmont Grand Hibernian train. For this role, it received an eye-catching blue livery, after briefly appearing in a temporary light green scheme, and although the Belmont operation has ceased in Ireland, 216 continued to stand out within the fleet, and as of early 2026, was still carrying its Belmont colours while working both Enterprise and InterCity services as required. Meanwhile, number 225 River Deal suffered severe underframe damage in a fatal level crossing collision on September 2, 2010, and was out of traffic for almost a decade, before returning to freight service on October 24, 2019, and passenger work on November 8 of the same year. Number 224 River Feel was withdrawn on July 7, 2020, following structural failure of the underframe, with the official Rail Accident Investigation Unit report published in July 2021 concluding that an inappropriate weld repair had been carried out to a structural chassis plate after confusion with a non-structural bed plate, and that this eventually led to the failure. Finally, number 230 River Bandon remained stored after its major fire damage, while number 233 suffered a bearing failure en route from Belfast to Connolly in October 2011 and had to be transported by road to Inshore for attention. The changing fortunes of the class also prompted thoughts of major rebuilding. In October 2016, Éireann Eireann indicated that it was interested in seeking proposals for a midlife refurbishment and repowering of most of the fleet. The concept envisaged a comprehensive floor-up replacement of engines and control gear, while retaining the existing cab controls, compatibility with the GN fleet and push-pull equipment, as well as the body, bogies and traction motors. In effect, this would have created a substantially renewed locomotive, while preserving the features necessary for integration with the rest of the railway's operations. Locomotives 201 and 205 were brought out of storage for internal and external inspection, apparently in connection with this project, and the programme was originally expected to commence in the first quarter of 2017, but was cancelled in early 2019. The naming and presentation of the class have always formed part of its appeal, with every locomotive in Iarnrod Eireann ownership being named after an Irish river, each carrying 2 trapezium-shaped nameplates on each side, one in Irish and one in English, with the names in uppercase. The Northern Ireland-owned locomotives, by contrast, carried English-only names, reflecting their separate ownership and identity. In some cases, the details varied, with 8209 carrying the allocated name River Foyle, but no actual nameplates, while 226 also carried an additional plaque commemorating 150 years of Thurles railway station, complete with the logos of Thurles Town Council and the Great Southern and Western Railway. The liveries carried by the class have been unusually varied by Irish standards, with the fleet having worn the original Iarnrod Eireann orange, the Northern Ireland Railways blue used briefly on 208 and 209, the original revised Enterprise grey and purple schemes, the green and silver InterCity livery introduced in the mid-2000s, a revised orange scheme with full yellow ends, the later refurbished Enterprise finish, the so-called common livery carried by 231 and 233 to allow them to blend visually with either Enterprise or Mark IV stock, the temporary pale green finish carried by 216 before Belmont repainting, and the striking Belmont blue itself. The common livery was adopted because, following the refurbishment of the Enterprise service in 2015 and 2016, only 6 locomotives received the full Enterprise finish, while others needed to remain operationally flexible without carrying standard intercity branding that was considered unsuitable for cross-border work. In conclusion, the Class 201 locomotives occupy a distinctive and rather complicated place in Irish railway history, being introduced as symbols of confidence, modernisation and investment during a period of economic change, and in engineering terms represented a considerable advance on what had gone before. Their long career has not been free from difficulty, and indeed has been marked by technical issues, changing patterns of train operation, long periods of storage for some members, and a gradual narrowing of their role. Even so, they have survived as the most powerful diesel locomotives ever to run in Ireland, and they continue to hold some of the nation's most recognisable services, and as a class, they embody both the ambition and the realities of railway modernisation. Impressive, innovative, occasionally troublesome, but ultimately enduring.